All right, good evening, everyone. I'm excited to introduce to you Dr. John Johnson. Dr. Johnson recently retired from the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History as the curator of the anthropology department. He served this position for approximately 34 years and has authored countless articles, both historical and prehistorical, of our people. Dr. Johnson has not wandered too far from the museum, where today he fulfills the title as the Curator Emeritus of Anthropology. We're excited to hear about our post-mission community at Saticoy. So without further introduction, Dr. John Johnson.
Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you to Matt and Eleanor for inviting me to give this talk this evening. And I'm looking at the names of the people who signed in. I too see a lot of people I know, not everyone though, but they're all old friends of mine. I'm glad to see them here. And so let's go ahead. I'm going to share the screen and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, we just did this a few minutes ago, and there's a way I could switch. Well, oh, here we go. Never mind. Sorry, I'm rusty on this. Okay, there we are. Whoops. So, let's see. So the title of my talk is The Chumash Community at Saticoy in Post-Mission Times. And the photograph that you see here was taken at Saticoy in 1933 by John Harrington. And the two men that you see here, Thomas Moore on the left, who half Chumash, and on the right, Jose Juan Olivas, both of them had been born and raised at Saticoy. And John Harrington went there in the company of these two and was recording what memories that they had at the time. Now, one can ask, why Saticoy? What is so interesting about Saticoy? And some of you, I think, probably know already that it was important in Chumash history. But the reason why I got involved in this is because for years I've been collecting information here and there about the people who lived at Saticoy. And a year ago, I had the opportunity of preparing an ethnohistoric background report for an archaeological mitigation study that was being done at Saticoy by Michael Macco and Al Knight. And so that gave me an opportunity to kind of pull together much of the information that I gathered over the years and do a bit of additional research and kind of pull it together in a coherent report. And so that now has been submitted. My report was submitted last fall, and now it's going to be coming out as an article in the next issue of the Journal of California and Great Basin Anthropology. So I'm just going to hit many of the highlights here, and sort of the details will be coming up in that article that will be published next month. And if anyone wants a copy of that, you can contact me. I'd be happy to send you a copy or provide them to Eleanor and Matt, and they can distribute them. But anyway, I want to give you some other reasons why we should study Saticoy, not just to prepare a report for an archaeological study, but because really a substantial portion of what we know about Chumash ceremonial practices, Chumash traditional dances, social political organization, material culture. Much of this information is coming from people and events that occurred at Saticoy, as told to John Harrington by several different people that he interviewed. In fact, he interviewed at least 3 different people, or 2 different people who've been born at Saticoy. And then he also interviewed, as we shall see, Fernando Librado, Jose Juan Olivas, Candelaria Valenzuela, Simplicio Pico, and Jose Peregrino Romero, all of whom had either lived at Saticoy or attended events there, at ceremonies there. So much of this information is incorporated into books. Like Eye of the Flute has several chapters that really are largely based on the information that came from Saticoy, from people who lived there. So another purpose for studying Saticoy is that it teaches us about what life was like in the post-mission period in enclaves where people still continued to speak their native language and carry on their cultural traditions. And these were kind of refugee camps, you might say, where people gathered in post-mission times. What I'm going to do here is reconstruct what I've done is reconstruct the biographies of the various people who lived at Saticoy, and this provides important contextual insight for the other kinds of information that we have about events and interactions that occurred at Saticoy between different people and different families. And then finally, I think a very important part of this study, and probably why many of you are signed on, is that tracing descendants of the people who lived at Saticoy helps people today, many of whom are in the audience now, who had ancestors who lived there. And so it helps connect the current generations to their history. Okay, so many of you know this already, but Saticoy is located east of Ventura. Today it's in the Ventura city limits. There is, on the right is a Google Earth a photo of Saticoy, and right where this circle is where the Chumash community of Saticoy was located. So I mentioned that I used a number of different sources for studying Saticoy. So what are some of these sources? Well, one of them would be, as I've mentioned, the ethnographic notes recorded by John Harrington from Fernando Librado in particular, but also from the others, Candelaria and Jose Juan Olivas, and so on. And then secondly, the mission and parish registers of baptisms, marriage, and burials, because the people who lived at Saticoy continued to have their children baptized at Mission San Buenaventura. When they died, they were buried in the mission cemetery. And when they were married, they were married there at the mission. The other source are the Spanish and Mexican period documents, correspondence, and land grant records. And finally, a very important source that I've used for this study are the 19th century census records, which list the names of people who were living at Saticoy. This is kind of a snapshot at several points in time of who was living there. Now, I mentioned the Spanish and Mexican period documents. Saticoy appears, the name Saticoy appears in the, I think around 1812 or so, I forget the exact date, but there was where the missionary at Saticoy was disputing someone who was trying to claim land up the Santa Clara River in the vicinity of Sespe. And the missionary wrote a letter saying, well, the cattle herds of the mission, they wander up into the place called Saticoy, where they grazed on the grass there, and sometimes on to Santa Paula. And so he was saying that they were concerned, or even all the way up to Sespe. And he was saying that they didn't want that land to be given away because the Indians had come from that area, and also that the cattle were using that area as pasture land. Here is in fact, a land grant diseño. A diseño is a map that was filed when someone would apply for a land grant from the Mexican government. And so this is 1843, where the applicant, Manuel Jimeno, applied for the Santa Paula y Saticoy grant. And you can see right here, there's Saticoy shown, written in on his grant. Now, he's applying for this land, even though Indians were settled there at this time. And we know this because 2 years later, there's a petition that's made by Luis Francisco. And he describes himself as a free Indian of Mission San Buenaventura. And he's saying he wants the property at Saticoy to be given to him by the governor of California, Governor Pio Pico, as a grant, because he said that after the mission was secularized, after Mission San Buenaventura was secularized, and the Indians became free citizens of Mexico, he said that he had been given Saticoy by the William Hartnell, who he refers to here as Don Guillermo Arnell. He says William Hartnell gave him that property at Saticoy, but he had a fire and his house burned down and he lost all the paperwork. So he sent this off to the governor of California, Pio Pico, and Pio Pico then turns around, as was usual practice, and he then sends inquiries out to people who lived in the area, citizens who lived in the area, to ask them what they knew about Luis Francisco's claim. And he sent one of them to the Juan Maria Sanchez, who was a neighbor owned the neighboring land grant to Saticoy, the Santa Clara del Norte. And he went to Juan Maria Sanchez and said, what about Luis Francisco? And he says, well, actually, his understanding was Luis Francisco was given a loan of living at that property. It was not really deeded to him by William Hartnell. And he said, anyway, Saticoy, everyone knows, is on my land grant. Doesn't belong to Luis Francisco. Well, Governor Pio Pico then asked the mayordomo of San Buenaventura, what his knowledge of it was. He reiterated that William Hartnell had only loaned the land to Luis Francisco, and it was not really granted to him. So Pio Pico did not approve Luis Francisco's grant. But here we have the diseño, another map that was filed with the Santa Clara del Norte grant, which is Juan Maria Sanchez's grant. And you can see he does indeed show Saticoy on his land grant here. But actually, Saticoy's on the other side of the river. It wasn't on his land grant at all. It was on the neighboring land grant, which was the Santa Paula y Saticoy rancho. Okay, well, let's consider now, who is this guy, Luis Francisco? This is a copy of his entry and that of his wife and several of their children in the Mission San Buenaventura Padrón. Now, the Padrón is a document that was kept at the missions that documented all the Indian families living at the mission. And so it gives Luis Francisco's name. You can see it here. Luis Francisco Yonce. He is from Mupu or Santa Paula. It says he was baptized on January 22nd, 1808, when he was 11 years old, and it gives his baptismal number. And then it gives that of his wife, where she was from, and so on, and then their children. So we know from this evidence that Luis Francisco was born about 1797 in the rancheria of Mupu or Santa Paula. His Ventureño Chumash name was Yonce. And this was also verified by Fernando Librado. He was baptized at 11 years of age at Mission San Buenaventura, as we've said, in 1808. He married Atenadora Maria, and here my pronunciation is probably not very good, but it's Siwatipiyewa, from the rancheria of Saapwa, which is up near Thousand Oaks, in 1813. And so he was just 16 years old when he got married, and Atenadora Maria was only 13 or 14. People got married as teenagers in those days. And we know from other documents that Luis Francisco, including Fernando Librado's testimony, that he worked as an arriero, a muleteer for Mission San Buenaventura. And we also can document in the mission records that he and Atenadora Maria had 6 children born between 1813 and 1835, 4 of which are listed in this record from the 1825 Patron. However, none of their children survived childhood. So there's other biographical details that we can gather about Luis Francisco. He was, we know from Fernando Librado's information provided to Harrington that he fought against the California forces of Jose Castro. When Jose Castro, who was a general in the Monterey area, came down in 1838, and he was trying to overthrow Carlos Carrillo as governor of California. And they had a battle, the Battle of San Buenaventura, which occurred there, and they fired cannon at the mission. And apparently Luis Francisco is said to have disabled one of the cannons of Jose Castro in that skirmish. We suspect that Luis Francisco was one of the Indians who, when William Hartnell visited the mission in 1839, he opposed granting the mission's rancho at Santa Paula to Manuel Jimeno. We know also from the records of cattle brands that Luis Francisco registered his own cattle brand at Santa Barbara in 1843. This is the same year that the Rancho Santa Paula y Saticoy was granted to Manuel Jimeno. And 2 years later, he petitioned Governor Pico for land at Saticoy. We know that according to Fernando Librado, that Luis Francisco was recognized as a judge and a capitan down Saticoy, Santa Paula way, of all the Indians who lived down that way, and that he maintained 2 adobe homes, one at Saticoy and also one at San Buenaventura. We know also from Fernando that he kept a tame bear that had been given to him as a gift by the Catanamuk chief at Tejon, and that he also was said he had a kind of an unsavory reputation. He was reputed, along with his wife, to dabble in poisons to control others. And we know that Luis Francisco gave his last fiesta at Saticoy in the spring of 1864, a few months before he died later that fall. So this is just a quick mini biography of what we know about Luis Francisco. There's some more details that will be in my article as well. And now, in 1852, I mentioned that we have census records that document the people at Saticoy. In 1852, the California state census took place. This is the only state census that we've done in California. The legislators were unhappy with the 1850s federal census of California because it vastly undercounted the people in California. So the legislature set aside money to conduct a different census, a state census, in 1852. And this is a very valuable document for our area because it lists the names of all the Chumash Indians living in the area. So here's a page from that 1852 census, and you can see I've circled in red there the community, the people who are listed living at Saticoy. And included in this is Luis Francisco. There he's the first person listed, and it's mentioned his occupation is farmer. Several of the men there, brothers of Candelaria, were listed as vicarios. There's 2 others that are listed as laborers, probably on nearby ranchos. And there's other people listed in the census. All of them can be identified. And I'm just going to point out a few. One is Cecilia here, who was the mother of Jose Juan Olivas. Then there's also Tomas Cora, who I'm going to talk about him in a moment. and Candelaria here, who was, of course, the famous mission or famous basket weaver at Santa Buenaventura in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and who also had been born and raised at Saticoy. So now Tomas Cora, who is he? Well, Fernando Librado refers to him as named Tomas Cola, but he's really, because Fernando, his name was pronounced that way by Chumash Indians because the R doesn't appear in Chumash languages, and so the R was converted to an L. Anyway, Tomas Cora is actually a saint's name, and that's who he was named after. He came from the Malibu coast. He came from one of the villages on the Malibu coast. And here in the left, you'll see is Fernando Librado's or Harrington's notes from Librado talking about how Luis Francisco brought the tame bear to a fiesta at Ventura, and that the bear trotted along on a rope behind him as Luis Francisco rode on horseback. And he shows a map and sketch of how Luis Francisco entered the fiesta with the bear on the rope. The other note on the upper right is that one of the Indians at Saticoy, Dorico, told Fernando that they first had the bear on tether all the time. They had him tied up all the time, but later they just let him run free, and then he would run and play with the dogs and go to the river with the dogs and then come back at night. And he used to sleep on the doorstep of the Tomas Cora's jacal, his traditional Tule house there at Saticoy. And this then, we also know more about Tomas Cora. There's stories told about him in for example, in December's Child. There's stories told about him, but Candelaria also recorded information about Candelaria, about Tomas Cora, and she said, close to Saticoy, there lived an old Indian named Tomas, who was deaf, and he would, from his cabin in the last days of December, he would watch the rising sun in front of the door, and he can see coming up over one of the peaks that he could see from Saticoy, the sun would rise, and when it would get to the middle peak, he would then predict that was time for them to prepare for the winter solstice ceremony. So this gives you some of the information about Tomas Cora and who he was. He was an important person at Saticoy, even though he was deaf. He also told Fernando also mentioned other stories about Tomas Cora, including the fact that reason why he went deaf was that he met an old woman carrying a bag of tar on her back. Now, this is a famous story that actually in various different versions is told by Indians all over Western North America. The basket carrier myth, where they grab children and throw them into this basket on the back. Well, anyway, he insulted her and she made him go blind. And that was why he was blind, according to Librado. So here are the people who were listed in the 1852 census. You can see on the left, this is their identifications. The only one I couldn't find is Candelaria because her baptism record doesn't exist. She apparently never got entered into any baptismal register, but all the others could be identified in the baptismal records. And you could see then their names, their birthplace, their age that was given in the census, and then their true age. You can see that pretty much the age of their true age matches the age given in the census. The other thing we can see here, which is very interesting, is that most of these people, actually more were from Mission San Fernando than were from Mission San Buenaventura. And the families that were from Mission San Fernando were Candelaria's parents and her siblings, and then several others also from San Fernando Mission. But they were not necessarily, most of them were actually Ventureño Chumash from the Santa Monica Mountains who had gone to Mission San Fernando. So they were actually Chumash, most of them living at Saticoy. So I'm going to point out a few here. This is Odorico. Odorico, actually, he was the only one living in Saticoy that came from Santa Barbara. His father was from Micu, or Dos Pueblos. And then I also want to point out Faustino and Cecilia. Well, Faustino was one of those from Mission San Fernando, and Cecilia was from Mission San Buenaventura. Okay, and here's the marriage records for those people I just some of them I just mentioned. This is the marriage record from 1851. This is a year just prior to the 1852 census. And you can see the first marriage listed is of Faustino and Cecilia. And then the next marriage is Odorico and Pomposa. And then the third marriage listed is Pomposa's mother, who's also named Pomposa, and her third husband named Santiago. Okay, so the next census that we have is the 1860 census, and there's a lot more people listed at Saticoy in the 1860 census. Some of them I'm going to show are, again, Luis Francisco. He's listed as a stock raiser, and as I showed earlier, he had his own cattle brand. There's also in this, we'll see, is Tomas Cora. There he is. And then we have Pomposa and her husband Odorico and their son. And then we have Candelaria next, shown here. So now, the other thing that's interesting is this statement here that the census taker had written on the side of the census. Now, one of the things I'll mention is the census taker wasn't, a lot of these names are kind of, are misspelled or misheard. And also the ages are wrong for many of the people. He apparently, in transcribing the information from his notes onto the census page, he got some things mixed up. But his statement here on the right is kind of interesting, and I've transcribed this for you in the next slide. He says, the Indians named as having no occupation are employed as servants and live in wigwams at a place Saticoy, township of San Buenaventura. And of course, one of the people listed in that census is Candelaria. And this is the earliest known photo that I know of Candelaria, who later became Candelaria Valenzuela. I've mentioned that not only did Harrington interview Candelaria briefly before she died, but he also did, of course, extensive interviews with Fernando Librado Quetzalcoatl. And Fernando knew many of the people of Saticoy. He attended the various fiestas and would visit there from time to time. He mentions to John Harrington many times incidents and stories of having been present at Saticoy and knowing the people there. And this is corroborated in another marriage record here, where two Saticoy residents are getting married in 1867. One of them is Pantaleon. He was Candelaria's brother, one of Candelaria's brothers, and he married Maria Antonia, who was another resident of Saticoy. And one of the interesting things is there's the best man is Fernando. Fernando Librado was the best man at their wedding. So Harrington took Fernando on in 1913 on a place name trip, an extended place name trip. And they made it through the Santa Monica Mountains out to the Malibu coast. They also went in various parts of other parts of Ventura County. And so here's a picture of the wagon and the horse, and with Fernando in it on the Malibu coast there. And you can, one of the places that they visited in the course of this trip was Saticoy. And so here's Harrington's rough sketch map. I think they even may have slept at Saticoy when they were on this trip, and just slept out on the ground there. And one of the interesting things, Harrington sketch maps are sometimes hard to read, but there is Luis Francisco's adobe, and as remembered by Librado, and then Librado also said that was the location of the sweat lodge that the Indians at Saticoy used, and he showed Harrington where that was located. Harrington also interviewed Fernando about the fiesta that was held in 1869, which he said was Pomposa's last celebration. When Luis Francisco died, in 1864, he designated 3 women as his heirs to Saticoy. And one of them was Pomposa, one of them was Cecilia, and the third one was Maria Antonia. And Pomposa in 1869 gave a big fiesta, and people from Santa Barbara, from Santa Ynez, from San Fernando, from Ventura, all came to this fiesta. And it's all described in Harrington's notes, which was published as in the book Eye of the Flute. This is the map that was reproduced in Eye of the Flute, shows where the railroad track is at Saticoy. It shows where the various houses were and where different events occurred at that fiesta. One thing I'll point out, though, on the upper right, this north arrow is wrong. The north arrow should be going that way, not this way. Okay, well, here's the genealogy of Pomposa. So Pomposa was chosen. She succeeded Luis Francisco as being the chief of Saticoy, the capitana of Saticoy. And this is her genealogy. Here she is, shown here. Here's Pomposa. So Harrington, and from both Fernando Librado and Jose Juan Olivas, he asked them, why did Luis Francisco give this, give his estate to these 3 different women? And they all said, well, he was their father. Well, he wasn't really their biological father. He was sort of their stepfather. And you can see here in Pomposa's genealogy how that occurred. Here's Pomposa right here. This is her mother, whose name was also Pomposa. And this was Pomposa's father over here. But Pomposa's mother's earlier husband had been a man named Pelayo Jose Ashane. And Pelayo Jose Ashane was the younger brother of Luis Francisco. So I think what happened when he died, Pomposa married her second husband here, who had several children. And in the 1860 census, the 2 children that did not die, the line through them indicates children who didn't survive, but Pomposa and 2 of her brothers are all listed living at Saticoy, because I think Luis Francisco sort of took over the role as being their stepfather. They then moved to Saticoy. Okay, now I mentioned that Cecilia was another of those who Luis Francisco raised. And this was her son, Jose Juan Olivas, who lived at Tejon when Harrington met him. And Harrington interviewed him extensively at Tejon, and then took him on various place name trips, just as he had with Fernando Librado. And this photo was taken at one of the trips they made into the San Fernando Valley, the west end of San Fernando Valley, which was on the Domecq Ranch. And the Domecq Ranch was north of what had been a village called El Escorpion by the Spanish. It's known as Huam by the Chumash, and Hucaoinga by the Tongva people of the San Fernando Valley. And for Jose Juan Olivas' his father's parents had both come from El Escorpion. So he knew something about that area too, and took Harrington to visit there. And he also went with Harrington to Saticoy. So this is Harrington's sketch map when he visited Saticoy with Jose Juan Olivas about 1917. And it again, here shows the railroad track running through the community. here's where the houses were located. And what's interesting too on this sketch map, I'm not going to go through all the different places that Harrington notes, but this is interesting. He says this is the Celiac, which is the ceremonial enclosure that was used during the ceremonial fiestas that they had at Saticoy. And then if we zoom in on that upper area where the houses are shown here, you could see Harrington also did a sketch map here, and he lists Luis Francisco's house, he lists Pomposa's house, and he lists Cecilia's house here, which he says then his informant's mother's house. So that would be Jose Juan Olivas, his mother, lived there. And then he also shows this long row of a long building with many rooms also on this map. And later, in fact, 16 years later, Harrington returned to Saticoy with Jose Juan Olivas and made this sketch map in 1833. And this is when Jose Juan Olivas and Tomas Moore both accompanied Harrington to Saticoy. Again, you can see the row of houses. Each of these maps is oriented a little bit differently, so it's hard to, this way would be north up to the upper right. Anyway, here's the railroad. Here's where the houses have been located. And then Harrington also shows again that room of that house with many rooms in it. And he mentions that on the left-hand side, there was the Rios family lived. And on the right-hand side, Jose Juan Olivas said he once lived in that side. Well, the community at Saticoy didn't last much beyond Pomposa's last fiesta. And I wish I knew more details why people left there. It may have been something to do with the railroad coming through about that time, and then maybe the Indians were forced out of their homes. I really don't know. That's some unanswered question that I have, is why did people leave Saticoy? But Pomposa moved to Ventura, where she lived. So did the other Saticoy residents. Most of them moved to Ventura, but some of them went to Tejon and joined the Indian community at Tejon, including Jose Juan Olivas. Okay, so here's Candelaria shown here, one of the famous photos of Candelaria. And then on the right is her nephew, Jose Juan Olivas, her brother's son. And this photograph was taken in the early 20th century by another anthropologist, C. Hart Merriam, when he visited Tejon. Okay, so here's their family. And what we have at this particular family in Saticoy is 3 generations who lived there. You have the original couple who were originally from El Escorpion, baptized at Mission San Fernando. That'd be Pedro Antonio Chuyuy, and his wife Uqueria. And then their children, all of whom lived at Saticoy, and then their spouses who lived at Saticoy. And then the 3rd generation here, which includes Jose Juan Olivas and his brother, and several Pomposa's, Maria Antonia's daughter, Juana Vasilia, and also another one of the residents in Saticoy and his son. So all of these were descended from or lived at Saticoy and were during the mid-19th century. And of course, shown here also as well, there's Candelaria, and there is Jose Juan Olivas. Okay, and then others who lived at Saticoy, I've mentioned briefly. One would be Francisco Moore. He was the son of Maria Antonia. His father was non-Indian. His father was Thomas Wallace Moore, who purchased the Saticoy Sespe land grant, and later on was shot and killed by people who were in a fight with him over land rights and water rights. And then Maria Antonia married Pantaleon, who would be Candelaria's brother. And then on the right, we have Jose Rios, who was the step-grandfather of Margarita Tumamaya, or of the Tumamaya children. And other people who were descended from Saticoy include Juana Rios here and Rana Rodriguez. She was the daughter of Jose Silvestre Rios in that last photo. And then Josefa Castellano, she was Pomposa's granddaughter, as shown here with 3 of her children. And of course, descendants of these people are still part of Ventura's Chumash community today, Ventura County's Chumash community today. And here we have a meeting of everyone back in 2008 at Saticoy. And this is after the property had been deeded over to the Barbereño Ventureño band. And finally, my last photo is of 4 Saticoy descendants here. That's Frank Lemos, Eleanor, of course, Julie, and on the right, Danny Lara. Frank and Danny are descended from Pomposa, and then Eleanor and Julie are descended from an ancestor who lived at Saticoy and later on married Juan de Jesus Tumamayan. So, in conclusion, what have we learned by this Saticoy case study? Well, I think that I hope I've shown that the combination of using these early census records, mission records, and ethnographic information woven together completes a bigger picture of that community and it gives you more contextual information about the people who live there. It also represents a well-documented case study of a refuge community where people continued to speak their native language and pursued cultural traditions well after the mission period. And other studies in California have emphasized how these refuge communities persisted in what areas that were hinterlands, far removed from the missions. However, Saticoy was close to one of the missions. So I'm coming up with a name, coining a name, Intraland. It was really close to the former mission, persisting there and surrounded by a dominant European culture, even though surrounded by a dominant American culture. And Saticoy represents an instance of a tribal community of former mission Indians, which did not become a reservation. And this is partly because it was on land that was owned, they didn't have title to, but there are many such communities in California. This is why we have non-federally recognized tribes, is because it is really kind of a historical accident that some communities became recognized tribes and some did not. It's very haphazard in California. But Saticoy is an instance of one of those communities, I think, that would have qualified to become a reservation had land been brought into the trust for the people who live there. And then finally, research such as this assists modern day descendants, such as you all who are listening to this, to connect to their family and community histories. Thank you. So I'm going to quit sharing, and then if anybody has questions, or maybe I should, in case someone wants to go back to one of my slides, maybe I should leave it here. So anybody have questions?
John, what we'll do is we'll monitor folks with their hands up in the gallery.
Okay.
And first come, first serve.
I'll be the first to say thank you, John, for putting this on. It was a really good presentation. Very informative. No questions from me, though.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else?
Sylvia or
Arlie? Comments?
Yeah, I have a comment. I wanted to say, John, thank you very much for your hard work on this.
You're welcome.
And a second, I live in Santa Paula. Actually, I wanted to share something. I do a lot of work for the Guadalupe Church here in Santa Paula, and they have a lot of history about the Chumash.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I just want to let you know there's some graves here as well on the property. I did a lot of interior work there, and I've noticed a lot of change, but it does bring massive people together still today.
Very good. I'd like to know more about that. Maybe we could have a conversation sometime
I would love that.
about that.
It was very, very good
Yeah.
presentation. Thank you very much, John.
Welcome. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Go ahead, Arlene.
I would like to say thank you very much, John. Like my son Sal said, we appreciate all the years that you dedicated to our family, and we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
John, we have a question in the chat from Kenny Gilliland.
Okay.
What were the historical structures made of in Saticoy?
Yeah, that's a good question. We know at least Luis Francisco had an adobe. We also know that, that census taker described the dwellings as wigwams, which I suspect were, traditional style, truly houses covered thatched with tule.
Mm-hmm.
But also there appears to have been some wooden structures there too, as well. I think many of those buildings were probably made from lumber,
Right. Yeah, it looked the rectangular ones probably.
Yeah,
Sure.
I know that Harrington says on that sketch map, one of the sketch maps, or the first one from Fernando Librado, that the sweat lodge, the Temescal, was made with planks of wood, dug into the side of the hill there.
Yeah. Raudel has.
Unfortunate.
Oh, sorry, John. Go ahead.
No, unfortunately, there's really a long archaeological record of people having lived at Saticoy that goes back, back to 8,000 years or more. And I think the springs that existed there really were attractive to native people, indigenous people, all through prehistory. And the one interesting thing is that when the first Spanish land expedition, the Portola expedition, came up, and passed down the Santa Clara River, when they're going up to found the settlement up at Monterey, and when they passed by an area they said had some very nice springs, and there were 20 houses located there. Mm-hmm. Now that sounds a lot like Saticoy. However, there is no one baptized from any place called Saticoy in the mission records. Mm-hmm. So, did the people, were they living there in 1769 when the expedition came through? And then the place had been abandoned by the time the mission was founded in 1782, was a village known by a different name. There's a name of a village that's on the Santa Clara River, Canaputicnon, which appears just the 3 years after Mission San Buenaventura is founded, and then doesn't appear any time after that. So was that located at Saticoy? Was that the village that the Portola expedition saw in 1769? There's a lot of questions we just don't know the answers to, and maybe there some additional documents will eventually surface that will shed some light on this. Right. But people were living at Saticoy over thousands of years. There's a series of archaeological sites, four archaeological sites on that property, right, in slightly different locations that date to different time periods.
Raudel.
Hello, John. This is Moki.
Hi, Moki.
How you doing, sir?
Good. Good to see you.
Good, good. I just like to thank you, John, for all the years of knowledge you provided my family and friendship. My mother, my grandmother, Carol Toledo, all my immediate family. I just like to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. And you're continuing doing this, and I just like to say thank you, my friend. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Some of your ancestors were living there at Saticoy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yours and other people's too. Yeah. The tomb of my ancestor who was living there was, she was married to a man that's listed, and I think she's listed too in that 1860 census. He was from Santa Cruz Island, and he was living in that Saticoy community, but he died. And then she remarried to Juan de Jesus Tumamaya. And her sister was also living at Saticoy and was the mother of Pomposa's granddaughter. was Pomposa's son had a child with her. So there are descendants today whose ancestors were part of that community and were listed in those census records, those early census records.
John, Ben Carriage has a question. Ben, can
Okay.
you ask your question?
Oh, hello. Hi. Okay, so I've done a little bit of messing around with these historic period sources, like the drawings and the census stuff and all the sort of ethnographic notes that not great ethnographic notes, but ethnographic style notes that Spanish and the Mexican period were taking. How do you disambiguate how much weird, anomalous, not correct, obviously like sort of phoned in information that ends up in there? And like so if you go back to that second drawing of the village, it's just full of chicken scratch and how do you decide this really? That's the question.
Well, Harrington, Harrington's, they didn't have recorders that they record people in those days that you could carry along with you. So he's writing really furiously, and when he's out there with people, he's quickly making a sketch map as well as trying to record other information they're giving him. So yeah, there are errors that sometimes creep into it. You've got to kind of take everything with a grain of salt and kind of check it and cross-check it if you can with other notes. One of the great things about Harrington is he took so much notes, so you can double check and cross check much of his information because he sometimes records it using from different people and also from he records the same information from the same person at 2 different times, but if you actually, I think those maps are pretty good if you kind of can, like you say, disambiguate them, if you can kind of take them apart and kind of transcribe what Harrington's saying, if you can kind of decode Harrington's shorthand, his initials that he uses for things or abbreviations that he uses for things, they're actually contain quite a bit of good information. Unfortunately, some of those maps from Saticoy, the problem is it's all covered with houses now, right? It's very different than when Harrington visited there. And so he's describing features that he was then seeing on the landscape, trees and orchards and buildings that, there's no trace of those today. So kind of, you'd have to go back to, I think, maybe aerial photos of, 1928 and other aerial photos in order to kind of see some of those places that Harrington is, and then kind of his sketch maps too, one time his north arrow is pointing up, another one's time is pointing down, another time is, he doesn't put the north arrows on the map, you just kind of have to figure it out. Another time it'll be to the left, another time to the right. It's kind of getting all of his maps oriented right. But I think if someone really were to put into effort, more work could be done to kind of match, where exactly on the ground maybe those buildings once existed. But apparently the railroad went right through where the houses were, where the people were living. And as I said, I wonder if that didn't have something to do with why the people moved or were moved. And I wish I knew where we could find reports on that. I don't know that it was covered by the newspapers of the time, and so would there be records, say, in the railroad archives or something, I don't know.
Thank you so much for answering that. Yeah, cool.
Moki?
Yeah, I'm listening to you, John, and about deciphering things. And, what really amazed me not too long ago, we were doing some cross-checking of place names on Santa Rosa Island and looking at all the notes, from Fernando. And what really amazed me is a lot of the slang he used, the Spanish slang that we still use today, that I grew up hearing my whole life living off Ventura Avenue, and that's where I really felt that I really put effort into though deciphering that slang that he was using, that I grew up hearing, that I know, and we were, basically kind of confirming notes and where place names were. And at times you really gotta, like you say with your maps too, read it between the lines and kind of at times just not a guess, but just put things together. And like I say, the slang that he used that's still being used today, that amazed me. To this day, it's still being used.
Well, you come from the same community that Fernando came from.
Yeah.
It shows the community continuity,
Yeah.
over time. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Because Fernando grew up in that San Buenaventura community, that was where he was raised. And he later moved on up to Las Cruces and Lompoc area, but he used to continually visit down to Ventura and yeah, that was his homeland.
Go ahead, Tim.
Eleanor?
And thank you, John, for sharing this valuable information with us this evening. I visualize Saticoy and going actually down the other way through to the beach to Muwu. That's the way, instead of the Santa Paula Tespe route. I see a lot of the people moving back and forth from the beach and Saticoy, that area. Has on the archaeological record, is there any documentation of sensitive areas in Saticoy? I know of one, but but it was a big area. Was there at that time, it was post-mission, was that at that time where our ancestors being buried at the mission still, or was there another place for the burials? Has there been any other burials around Saticoy that we're aware of?
Yes, in
I
fact,
just know of one, like I said. So
yeah, there's two questions I hear in your what you were asking. One
okay.
is the people, Luis Francisco, his wife, many of the people who lived at Saticoy were buried at Mission San Buenaventura in the Mission
Okay.
Cemetery, but
Okay.
not all of them. For example, I mean, Odorico, we don't know where Odorico was buried,
Okay.
so I was interested when that church in, Guadalupe, a church that was mentioned, whether, maybe I wonder when that got established, and maybe some of the people from Saticoy were buried there. I don't know when that church
Oh,
was founded, or the Santa Clara church,
okay.
that, some of the people could have been buried there, and I have never looked in those records.
Okay.
But then to answer your question about older burials from earlier times, yeah, one of the things I did, I was contacted by a man who used to be a beekeeper, or he still is a beekeeper, but he kept bees down there on the land near the railroad tracks, or down there, and he was good friends of the Vanonis who owned that property, and so he took me to visit a year ago, last summer. He took me to meet with Evis Vanoni, who was 103 years old.
Well, let me right here. I have his obituary. Bless his heart. He passed away May 2nd at 104 years old. I had the pleasure of meeting him as well.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I recorded an oral history interview with him, and I know I heard that he just passed away.
Yeah.
But he was, he was amazingly clear. And maybe he told you too. He told me the story of the different discoveries they had made on the property. And there was a cemetery that they discovered, which they ended up burying. Basically, it's buried deep underneath those houses.
Okay.
Yeah, when they were leveling the land, they came across a cemetery, and they pushed everything into a gully and covered it up. So
What was it? What
it was
also
just-
is in, I'm sorry.
go ahead.
What also was interesting to me is, for I guess about 25 years ago, before that was even there was just orchard. And after it rained, we would walk through the orchard and we would still find beads.
Ah, you did yourself, or
I
he
did
taught you?
myself. I did
Ah,
myself.
okay. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So
Great.
it's very, that area is very special to me.
Yeah.
Thank you, John. It's good seeing you.
yeah. It's nice they've set aside that area for your tribe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Timothy?
Yeah, John, I just had a question, and I think my knowledge of how the missions function might be a little short here. If there had been a village at Saticoy during the founding of the mission, would the people in Saticoy have been close enough in proximity to the mission that Saticoy would have been emptied as people were brought to the mission?
Well, the mission records, record for everybody, virtually everybody. They record, I mean, at San Buenaventura especially, they have very good records at San Buenaventura. And they were very good, those missionaries were very good record keepers. In fact, there was a complaint made by the Presidio Comandante that the missionary at San Buenaventura, the Indians weren't learning Spanish because the missionary was preaching to them in their native language. That was in 1800. So the missionary who was there had picked up Ventureño Chumash and knew something about it. But anyway, they list, everybody is listed from where they came from, what village they came from, what rancheria they came from. So
Yeah.
they're in, I mentioned there's that rancheria Canaputeknon. I know my pronunciation is probably terrible, but it's spelled different ways in the mission records. And but it's only apparently in existence just the first 3 years after the mission was founded. There's no one baptized from there after that. So
Okay.
I don't know what that means. We do know there were records of warfare going on between Indians of the interior and Indians on the coast. And of course, if you're coming from the interior, coming down the Santa Clara River Valley, you're going to go right through Saticoy. So did they force the people, did the people kind of move just out of protection to move to Muwu or one of the other coastal settlements in order to seek protection, and they didn't reoccupy it? I don't know. That's pure speculation, but that's one possibility.
Well, no, definitely. Thank you for your thoughts, because I mean, I think you're going to have as good of intuitions on this as anybody else around.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
I think so. Also, Marianne Methune told me never retire. You're going to be 5 times as busy in retirement as you were when you were employed.
Well, but my wife tells me, she says, I haven't seen much difference. You're still doing what you're doing before you retired. So
it's great.
I hope to do a little bit more traveling actually than I have been able to. But I still have things, promises to keep and projects to finish. So
very good.
that'll keep me busy for a while.
All right. I'll go ahead and mute myself. It looks like there may be some questions or comments in the chat here.
So to answer your question about the St. Sebastian Church, Joseph or Jude Valencia said that it was opened in 1889, and they're told that their burials there by a priest.
Okay. Well, I
I
think they
don't
said,
have the, I'm sorry, I don't have the particulars. He doesn't remember who told it, who the name of the person who told him, but it was the priest that had retired from there recently.
John,
Interesting.
would some, let's say some people from there were working on ranchos, would there be cases of them being buried in like the ranchos cemeteries? Were there rancho cemeteries? Or
yeah,
would
that could be the case. You know, there's a number of people who we can document as living at Saticoy in 1860, you know, in that 1860 census record, who we don't know what became of them. You know, we don't have any burial records for them.
right.
Those that moved to Ventura, we do find their records in Ventura's, in the San Buenaventura burial register. But, there's others who we don't know. You know, we can't, there doesn't seem to be a record at San Buenaventura anyway.
Right. Well, any further questions? I see no hands, but a great number of people. Well, waya waya, and Noan Kalakumiliu. We're very grateful to all of you who have joined, and especially grateful to John Johnson, Dr. John Johnson, Curator Emeritus of the Anthropology Department at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, for this wonderful presentation. What's your next presentation going to be on, John? we will get back to you on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'd be happy to give talks in the future, but I'll let it rest for a while.
Okay, sounds
Okay.
good. We'll put a couple between you and your next visit. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me and having me here. It's good to see everybody.
Yeah. So I'm trying to, can you unshare your screen, John?
Yeah, let me see. Whoops. No. I think I messed up.
Recording.
I will stop the recording.
Jesus.